In the year 2000, Iraq's President Saddam Hussein stopped using the US dollar for oil sales, switching instead to the euro. He quickly amassed 26 billion euros in oil revenue. Shortly after, his government was overthrown and he was executed. A decade later, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a unified, gold-backed African currency to bypass the dollar. Before this Pan-African financial network could materialize, a civil war dismantled his regime, and Gaddafi was killed. Around the same time, Iran, sitting on 10% of the world's oil reserves, set up a financial board to process European oil trades in euros. The United States responded with crippling economic sanctions that severed Iran from the global market. These outcomes have established a precedent in global diplomacy. Any nation attempting to decouple from the American currency faces consequences that often involve total economic isolation or regime collapse. This leverage relies on a hidden architecture of global economics that allows the U.S. to exert pressure far beyond its borders. The U.S. dollar functions as an inescapable network that dictates alliances and shapes global conflicts through its control over every nation's resources. For centuries, global trade relied on a simple barter system of precious metals, primarily gold. But during the First and Second World Wars, the United States stayed neutral, selling massive amounts of weapons and food to warring nations. By the end of World War II, the U.S. had hoarded 22,000 tons of gold, nearly 70. To help Europe rebuild, the U.S. rolled out the Marshall Plan, distributing over $13 billion in aid. But there was a catch. These massive loans were issued entirely in U.S. dollars, and they had to be paid back in U.S. dollars. This created a permanent demand cycle. To rebuild their cities and feed their citizens, European countries had to buy resources using American currency. To pay off their new American debt, they needed to acquire even more of it. Washington successfully convinced the world to back their domestic economies with American paper instead of physical gold, locking the globe into a financial system controlled entirely by the United States. By 1971, this system hit a critical failure point. The United States had printed far more currency than it actually had in its gold vaults. As foreign nations realized the math didn't add up, they panicked and began demanding their physical gold back. Facing a total drain of the national reserves, President Richard Nixon issued an executive order that severed the tie between the dollar and gold. Overnight, the currency backing global trade became backed by nothing but a government promise. To prevent a total collapse of the dollar's value, the U.S. engineered a pivot, approaching Saudi Arabia, a nation with massive newly discovered oil fields, but serious security concerns. The deal was simple. The U.S. would provide absolute military protection for the Saudi kingdom, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia would only accept U.S. dollars for its oil. This arrangement birthed the concept known as the petrodollar. Soon, the rest of the OPEC nations followed suit. Because every modern industrialized nation requires oil to function, every country on Earth was suddenly forced to acquire and hold U.S. dollars in their national reserves just to keep their lights on. By tethering the dollar to energy, the U.S. ensured that every country must maintain dollar reserves simply to function in the modern age. Mapping global transactions reveals the SWIFT network. Though an international board oversees these transfers, deep integration with U.S. banks gives Washington indirect control. The U.S. exploits this via primary sanctions, unplugging nations from SWIFT to freeze their trade, and secondary sanctions, punishing anyone who helps them. The real-world results are severe. Domestic supply chains freeze and inflation spikes. The isolated nation's purchasing power evaporates, completely paralyzing the local economy. The United States maintains a unique ability to dismantle a rival's economy through digital isolation, achieving strategic goals without the use of kinetic force. When the U.S. banned Russia from the SWIFT network during the Ukraine conflict, it sent a harsh message to the rest of the world. Other global powers realized that their national wealth and trade capabilities were entirely dependent on staying in Washington's good graces. This realization triggered a massive acceleration in de-dollarization. China and Saudi Arabia recently completed their first major transaction in yuan. India and the UAE have signed agreements to trade in their own local currencies, actively seeking ways to bypass the dollar. The most coordinated challenge is forming within the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This coalition is openly discussing the creation of a new trade-weighted shared currency designed specifically to facilitate global commerce independent of the U.S. financial system. Dismantling the dollar's monopoly is a monumental task. The petrodollar is deeply hardwired into the infrastructure of global debt, shipping, and banking. Reversing 80 years of financial engineering will not happen quickly. However, the aggressive use of sanctions has pushed long-standing rivals to coordinate alternative trade systems, potentially ending the era of a single, centralized global currency.